Hello, I'm Rory McKiernan, and you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. A huge welcome to all you regular listeners from around the world, and a special welcome to anyone new who is joining us for the first time. A big thanks, as always, to all you patrons who chip in to support the podcast over at loveandcourage.org. And apologies that I'm a bit slower releasing this episode. I've been delayed due to finalising a new series of my other podcast, the Creative Souls of Clare podcast. So it's good to finally get this episode out there. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. And my guest is Michael Barron. Michael is a well-known Irish human rights and equality activist. He's originally from rural County Kilkenny, where he tells me he grew up as a young gay man dancing to Madonna, while many of the other boys were focused on hurling and other sports. And he shares this and some more fascinating stories and insights from growing up in Kilkenny and coming of age in Dublin and New York. Lots of great stories to come here. So Michael is currently working as the executive director of the Rowan Trust, which is an important foundation that funds social movements, campaigns and initiatives. It's great to see the work that they've been doing recently. Since the 1990s, Michael has worked with communities that have been pushed to the margins. As a frontline worker, he's been a community worker. He has been an executive director of a number of national organisations, also a researcher, a grantmaker and a campaigner. As well as being an activist, he's also a great thinker and he's a bit of a scholar. He has a PhD in the social sciences and he tells me he's also working on a book. I first met Michael back when he was working as the founder and executive director of BelongTo, which is a pioneering LGBTI plus organisation that does amazing work with young people in Ireland. Michael went on to play a leading role in the marriage equality referendum. He also headed up a campaign to remove the so-called baptism barrier from Irish public schools in 2018. Both major milestones in our recent history here in Ireland. And as you'll hear now, Michael doesn't shy away from taking on important issues such as separation of church and state, trans rights, and the rise of the far right. We also reflect a lot on our shared experiences of working in the non-profit sector, some of the trials and tribulations, some of the highlights, and we talk about the importance of authenticity, creativity and self-care. So here we go. Let's get started. We'll jump in now and get going with the Love and Courage podcast conversation with Michael Barron. Michael, you're very, very welcome to the podcast. I feel like I don't know what I feel like. I feel like I've kind of aged now that I'm talking to you, because it's been many, many years since we kind of used to bump into each other at various conferences and events, and there's been probably at least a decade has passed to catch up on, and it just makes me kind of reflect back on where that decade has gone, basically. So I need you to answer that for me. That's your first question.
It's Spanish. We're never getting it back again. We're just growing old, or just nothing else. No, actually, I think we've got younger. I think it's funny even just catching up with you there. I think our outlook on the world since then till now has definitely got more radical. I think we were a little bit squashed into roles that had a certain conservative edge to them, and I think we've both broken free of those. So we're getting younger.
Yeah. Okay. So for listeners that aren't aware, we're really talking about NGO leadership, and both of us being involved in running organisations and being on the merry-go-round, looking for funding, talking the talk and walking the walk and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose what you might be alluding to, at least from my perspective, was how can you stay true to yourself and be authentic within these roles, and there's what level of tension is innate within all of that?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, for us, when I think back on us, well, you and Spun Out and me and BelongTo, which were the two organizations that we were heading up, there was this constant need to raise money to keep the operations going, and that fundraising round that we all had to do, we all, even at the time, found it problematic often, and now that we don't have to do it any longer, I think we're relieved and can reflect back on, just what you wouldn't do if you had the time back again, and I think there's just so much pressure put on organizations to fundraise. I think you can kind of lose your vision sometimes.
Isn't a certain amount of that true of all, or not, maybe not all roles, but I mean, as I speak to you now, you've got a David Bowie poster behind me, so it's like he was maybe a prime example of someone that actually did live authentically, because he was trailblazer and he really owned it and went the distance in that regard. And we were talking about Sinead O'Connor just before we start recording, and yet another person who's really owned it, their authentic selves. And I suppose that ultimately is a value that most people would like to think they aspire to. But then when we get into professional settings, you know, something, obviously we can't, maybe our full self isn't appropriate at all times, that you don't want to be like all singing, all dancing. But yeah, I suppose for me, there's a certain amount of, yeah, I don't know. It's well, okay. I'll let you go. You take it away there. I'll just sit back and reflect.
Well, I just talk about David Bowie instead and answer the question.
Well, how can we be more like Bowie? But it's basically like, I don't think it should be one or the other. That's kind of what I'm getting at. You know, that because you want people to be themselves and be happy in their workplaces and in their roles, and not have to pretend or ascribe to a certain way of being that doesn't necessarily serve the individual or indeed serve the whole.
Totally. And I think, well, look, I think there's so much to that. And as we talk, you know, I think we're both also dressed and looking the way that we feel comfortable as well, which I think at points maybe we were, you know, in our professional roles, maybe shown not to do, you know, as I was saying earlier on, Rory, like I remember wearing suits when in retrospect kind of going, why was I wearing a suit? You know, and now I'm dressed the way I am, which is with a t-shirt and earrings and a David Bowie poster, you know, and I'm much older and wiser, I think. So I think there is something to it. And I just saw the David Bowie documentary actually, and the Sinead O'Connor one in the last week. It was amazing thing that Bowie says about an artist. And I think that social justice activists have a lot in common with artists and are often artists, and vice versa. It's a continuum, of course. But when Bowie is talking about artists, he talks about being just walking out into the sea, and when you reach the point at which your toes just barely touch the ground, but you're lifting off, and you're just that little bit uncomfortable outside your comfort zone, that's the perfect location to be. And I often think about that in terms of activism as well, that we do need to push ourselves into areas where we're not totally comfortable. Like, we don't need to go so far that we drown, you know, but to get to that point where we're not sitting back and are too comfortable, because it is this ever-evolving world and ever-changing world, of course, you know, and we need to be comfortable with the discomfort of that.
Yeah, you've hit on something big there, comfort zones. And yeah, I suppose within that is, do we want to be growing or sitting still? And sometimes it's nice to sit still and not be growing all the time, but I definitely made a big decision recently, which I won't get into here, but it definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone and caused me a few months of really shaking myself up. And I'm now sort of, the decision's made, it's all action stations, but it's bringing me back to like versions of myself that did previously exist when I was a bit more braver, to be honest, about doing things. And then you kind of find these little sweet ledges and you hang out on the ledge, and life is good, life is grand, but you just know that you're not fully pushing it, or you're not. And again, I preface that by saying pushing it isn't always a good thing either. Okay. But just that feeling, that zing in yourself, feeling alive, feeling the buzz, feeling an energy, feeling alive.
Yeah. And look, now you're touching on so much as well. Like, because I do think, you know, one of the things that I find in the role I'm in at the moment, so my work role, whatever, which is running a foundation that funds social justice work, is that, you know, a lot of activists are really tired, you know, and are on the edge of exhaustion because they have been on the edge of innovation and change and been part of being responsive to such a ever-changing world, and the fears and anxieties that other people have, that, you know, we can become sponges too, you know. So the ability to sit still and not have to be forced to change, you know, or not feeling that force to constantly change is really good as well, you know. So it's not one or the other. There are moments, I think, when it's so important that we do get to have that comfort and stillness as well, you know.
Yeah, I had a good conversation over the weekend with a friend of mine who's a musician, and basically talking about that, exactly what you're talking about, this sort of rest, renewal, reflection and contemplation. And if you want to be involved in art, certainly pretty much all artists I know, they need quiet time or time out to go into their studio or go write songs or go, you know, rest after a tour of various concerts or gigs. But likewise, I see that in social change, people that are pushing boundaries, people that are leading on the edge, activists, that they need that kind of reflective other space. And, even Gandhi used to do his famous salt marches, but then have a retreat. But the issue that came up in talking to my friend was a sense of guilt amongst this idea like time out. And I was like, it's not time out, it's actually time in. It's time in where you actually get to look into the well, refill the well, explore what the well is. But we live in this kind of extractive, hyper-productive economy that pushes individuals within an inch of themselves. And this is where it gets tricky with funders and demands and KPIs and all of that, which are all essential. It's good to have transparency. It's good to have goals. But if you're actually exploiting and milking the actual energy of the individual or the group of individuals, then it's a zero-sum game ultimately.
Totally, yeah. I mean, and you're back to, class issues as well, aren't you? Class and race and minority issues where often the people who are forced to the edge are living on the edge because they're born on the edge anyway because of their identity, are the ones that are most often milked, and yeah, and I really like the movement of, that like self-care is resistance, particularly if you are coming from a minority group, whether it's LGBT or a migrant or a traveller or working class person, and we're often the people that have that kind of guilt as well, that we're kind of brought up with this guilt that we're not good enough anyway. And, there's kind of markers of success, whether it's the local sporting team or doing well in school or whatever those normal markers are, there's these additional barriers to reaching them. And, I was talking to a really good friend of mine at the moment, recently, Amel, and she was just talking about, being Algerian and living in Ireland, and me being queer and living in Ireland. For a lot of our work, like we almost felt like we had to be that much better than everybody else at doing the day-to-day job. I mean, we felt better, but we had to deliver more, to be taken as seriously as others, and I think there was also a big issue of social capital in that we didn't start at the same level of social capital as others. And yeah, and just the idea that you could be from a minority community pushing a particular issue and take a month off is kind of alien to people, but that's necessary for them to be able to sustain themselves. Yeah.
I feel that there's still a huge way to go in terms of understanding that, because you will often hear this kind of refrain that, sure, aren't we all equal now? And I hear it said about LGBTQI plus communities and others and women, sure, like there's every opportunity now for everyone, that's all sorted kind of thing. And yet when I look around where I live in rural Ireland, there are no gay bars. I very rarely, if ever, see a gay couple holding hands or anything like that. And you occasionally would hear derogatory comments publicly amongst teenagers and so on down the street. So like on that sense, but then statistically in terms of mental health rates and evidence base for women or for other communities, the stats are still pretty bleak in a number of areas. So there clearly is unfinished business there.
Yeah, I think somehow the marriage equality referendum, made it feel like we'd reached a certain point, and it did indicate that we reached a certain point in terms of the majority of people voting on something which wasn't really about marriage equality. I don't think at all. It was about the acceptance of LGBT people, or LGB people in particular, I suppose, in Irish society. But also it kind of gives an artificial sense of, the depth to which these issues go, that there isn't curable by, a single vote in one day,
Yeah.
That's the stuff that's generational. And then if we look at it across communities as well, of course, you have LGBT people living in poverty, LGBT travelers, LGBT people seeking international protection. So all of that together, shows that we've like a huge way to go. And of course, the other thing is that maybe people aren't able to pay attention to sometimes because there's so much going on all the time, is the pushback, and we are experiencing, like we have as a society done really well, in many respects around identity, people's identities in the last couple of decades in particular, but we are now experiencing the pushback in terms of, far right narratives that have become mainstreamed and all those pieces at the moment. I mean, of course we have, trans people's basic ability to live as people being debated on the public airwaves, and that's something I thought, if you'd asked me if that was going to happen 5 years ago, I would have said, no, we're past that. But I thought we were past that 5 years ago, and we're not, because there is a reactive pushback going on now that we're experiencing.
I wonder about that in the context of Ireland, because we've had legislation and we've had a certain degree of change, and particularly in relation to trans rights over the number of years. And for the most part, it seemed that we were moving along with a gradual pace of positive change, and yet something, particularly in the last 24 months, but it feels like it's not just something that has happened as a natural reaction. It's been stoked and curated, and it's part of an international push to essentially use trans people as fodder for a bigger, wider narrative that is speaking to people's frustration with life as we know it and systems as we know it. And suddenly, in the race for the Tory leadership, for instance, suddenly they're debating trans people while their whole country's falling down around them. How are trans people suddenly the fall guys or fall people in the mix?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it is often at these moments that, some of the most marginalized people become the target and become the wedge issue. And I think, and you're right, I mean, this is a completely internationally stoked kind of anti-trans movement that's part of a larger far-right narrative that's gone on everywhere in the world. Like there are specific kind of issues that are raised in Ireland that are very often religious and Catholic in their basis, and the trans one is, I suppose, an example of that. And then there are ones that aren't necessarily religious but work everywhere. And the trans issue works everywhere in the world. It's like the uniting kind of commentary that unites all far-right organizations, whether they have a religious bent or not, and it's extraordinary as well, because what they're doing is, of course, using the language of equality to artificially pitch women against trans people, and I mean, and it's something that we were well beyond, I would have believed. And actually, I've obviously worked with trans young people in particular for many years, and the level of vulnerability that we're talking about, and I hate describing young people as vulnerable, but in reality, it's really true about a lot of trans young people, what they have to go through in terms of coming out, seeking support from their families. I mean, it can be really, really tough, and it's been really, really tough on an awful lot of young people that I know very well personally. So for them to be now somehow targeted in a way that they weren't expecting, it's just kind of a double blow, and it's kind of a confidence trick on them almost as well. We're kind of going, okay, we're in a country that has this really good legislation, things are going well, you had a review of the legislation, it's going to be better, and then we're kind of hit with this stuff that's going live on national radio, and there's 5 or 6 commentaries in national newspapers, and people at checkouts are talking about announcements about unisex toilets and all the stuff that's going on at the moment that it's no reality. There's no reality on what a trans person experience is at all. But obviously, it's been, as you say, it's stoked for other reasons.
Yeah, I think the welfare. I mean, it's all very much couched under the welfare of the individual. It's like, will somebody think of the children, or and that's why I think what was particularly reprehensible about that school teacher in County Meath using the testament or the life of a young student in his care, or he wasn't even a teacher of this student, but weaponizing the student's life for a public and indeed a national and international battle that he was waging as part of an ideological war anyway. And so I find myself thinking about that individual student and what are they. I don't see very little about that student, and maybe rightfully so. We shouldn't be zoning in on one individual, but I'm concerned for that person. They were already living a challenging period, no doubt, as any young person's life is challenging, formative years and so on.
Yeah, I think this is exactly right. I think when we listen to these, essentially, and I'm using far right, it's a kind of very general term, by the way, here. Look, we can talk about what's the right term another time, but like extremists, whose mission is to sow division, let's put it that way, in society. I think sometimes, like particularly media commentators can get into these discussions as if they're abstract, that we're having some sort of ideological discussion about what gender is. Kind of go, well, no, the real question is like, what hurt is this causing, and who is it causing it to? So it's causing hurt to real trans young people. It's causing hurt to real migrant people. It's causing hurt to real travelers. So it's not abstract. And we found that during the marriage equality referendum, when, I don't know if you remember, back in 2015, these posters went up, basically on will somebody think of the children? And we were ready, like we knew this was going to be a talking point. And I suppose we were able to, at the time, put out an alternative narrative, which was saying, yes, marriage equality does raise a whole bunch of young people and children's protection issues. But the problem here is homophobia and transphobia. That's what's hurting children and young people. LGBT people aren't hurting children and young people. People who are being homophobic and transphobic are. So let's have that debate. Let's have the debate about how hurtful and dangerous homophobia and transphobia is to people, not some debate about unisex toilets, which is just not an issue,
Mm-hmm. So maybe just let's switch gear for a little bit, Michael, and take the spotlight back onto you specifically, because one thing I don't know much about is I know fair bit about an amount about your professional life, but I don't really know anything about Michael, the man, the myth, the legend, and like just even just some of the as they say to like the musicians or rock stars or whatever. It's like, tell me about the early years. So just generally where you're from and what your upbringing was like, and maybe some sort of the milestones around
Sure.
how you grew up.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so I grew up in Kilkenny in a small place called Glenmore, and I grew up in a farming family, so we were farmers. I am the youngest of six kids who are now, obviously I'm 47, so they're like certainly not kids anymore. When I was 8 or 9, I think, my parents sold the farm. It's a small farm, and bought the local pub. So then we became publicans. So we were farmers, publicans, very typical country Irish upbringing. Yeah, I mean, what was childhood like? Yeah, it was a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, my family were great. My sisters, like I had 4 older sisters who I absolutely idolized. But I suppose we were hit by emigration when I was very young, because I was been growing up during the 80s. So my older sister, who was 12 years older, emigrated. I think I was 8 when she emigrated, and then another sister emigrated when I was 10, 11, 12. So our family, most of my family emigrated when I was quite young. And that was, yeah, as a kid, when you're close to your family, that was really devastating, And I remember there was these, it was the Aer Lingus ads on television, which was like, look up, it's Aer Lingus. And as a kid, even though not really totally understanding what the whole idea, not even understanding this was an ad, what I mean, would be, was obsessed with like looking at airplanes and thinking of, my family, were they on one? Where were they going? All of that stuff, it's, yeah, I was quite bereft when people left. And they had to for economic reasons. I mean, there was no work to be had in Ireland in the mid 80s or up to the late 80s. And then also I went to school. I mean, I grew up I realized I was gay quite young. I think it was probably about 10 or so. I grew up in an area that was Kilkenny, right? So it was like a big hurling sporting area. So there's a lot of machismo around that, which I was definitely not into or didn't fit into. I hated hurling, wasn't into it at all. And it was really used as a regulatory system, so it kind of regulated real boys that would become real men versus, gay, wimpy, whatever, who wouldn't. Maybe even gay wasn't used as the word, but it was a way of dividing you into kind of different groups. And also because we had the pub, I'd be working in the pub at a very young age, so I'd be kind of confronted with it all the time. And even though I'd have tactics, so the tactics were the first person who come into the pub, you get all the information out of them about hurling. So I didn't care. I wouldn't go to a match. I wouldn't watch it, whatever. So I'd just kind of siphon all the information out of the first person that would come in, and then I'd be able to repeat it back to anybody else that would come in afterwards. And it was like a survival technique, because if you weren't able to talk about hurling, there was just no point in being around, kind of way. Like there was no other conversation to be had. Yeah, so there was, yeah. So sorry, I'm saying a lot there. From immigration and hurling and masculinity, a lot of things on it would go. But it was, yeah. I mean, I left home in 1992, so it was kind of, in Irish terms, I suppose, the beginning of the Celtic Tiger, I suppose. But obviously, with no concept of that at that time at all. At 17, and actually really wanted to leave, like I really wanted to go. I had these kind of sights set on, I was really into music and I had this sights set on like going to New York and bright lights, big city, and also like really wanted to come out, at that stage too, and kind of moved to Dublin and studied history and English in college. And in my mind, Dublin was always just going to be like a pit stop on my way to New York or somewhere else. Kind of way I didn't know I was moving there. Yeah, and moving from the country I went to Trinity, which was class privilege in the place was just seeping. The majority of people were from South County Dublin and then also from England. People couldn't or didn't get into similar universities in England who go to Trinity. So there was just not a whole lot of space to be a 17-year-old queer country boy. It just wasn't on the radar at all. So but also again, like being resourceful as we are when we're young, like you find your tribes outside of that, and I found the LGBT community in Dublin outside of that. And it was a really exciting time to come out as queer in Dublin as well. It was the beginning of the boom. Homosexuality was really decriminalised in 1993. So soon after that, I came out and bars started opening, performances started happening, drag started happening. It was, and you very much felt you were part of a really big, irreverent movement.
Yeah. Do you sense that, you were almost a recipient? I was going to say beneficiary, but more recipient. Like it's ultimately about your rights, your right to be who you're born to be. But you just kind of came of age at that threshold where like the nation state legitimized that you weren't a criminal, like, and so I'm just mindful, like, the people who came after you, maybe things were somewhat better, hopefully are a lot better. But those that came behind you lived in a very harrowing kind of state, literally state.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and a really good friend of mine, Owen Collins, who worked in LGBT rights for years, unfortunately passed away earlier on this year. But he was the first LGBT activist I ever met. And it was around kind of the mid-90s. And it was the first time I realized there was such a thing. I didn't even know there was a thing. You know what I mean? I didn't even know it was something that people did, But yeah, his kind of life of growing up in like a decade earlier versus mine is just like night and day. I mean, that decriminalization was an enormously important moment in society. Like it essentially went from state sanctioned homophobia to non-state sanctioned homophobia, but it actually meant a huge amount. I mean, it's not like everybody suddenly became LGBT friendly or anything like that, but you knew you weren't going to be arrested, and you knew you weren't going to spend the night in the cop station, which loads of people did. It's a very big untold story. You have to be told.
Yeah, there was a case came up in the media recently. I think maybe people are calling for a review of it. I'm not sure. Perhaps it was a murder that happened in Wicklow in the 80s or 70s or 80s. I'm not sure. And anyway, the LGBT community were targeted, and hundreds of men were rounded up and questioned, and it was seen as this mass targeting exercise.
Yeah, that was the Charles Self case. Yeah, so he was a guy who worked in RT. And it was in the 80s where homosexual sex was illegal. So the guards essentially used the moment to round up and take details of people, which of course is usually threatening because they were taking details of their family, where they lived, and men may have been married and all of that. So it was huge intimidation. People left the country after being interviewed by the guards. People committed suicide, unfortunately, after being interviewed by the guards. It was an enormously awful experience for an awful lot of people to have. But yeah, the guards were literally going into pubs, or the one pub in Dublin, and taking names and addresses, and it was really atrocious.
Yeah, so that could have been like, maybe up to 40 or 50 years ago, or 40-ish years ago. And you could be talking about, we're talking about men that are now perhaps in their 60s. So, it was interesting for me, because on that vein that sometimes we think things are all sorted. Well, there was a lot of damage done to a lot of people over the many, certainly decades and indeed centuries, whether it be Magdalen laundries or other things. And history doesn't just get rounded up with a bow on it. So there's still real lives affected to this day over this and in many other areas of society. So I think with that in mind, it's the importance of honouring and recognising and remembering and healing and transforming and
exactly.
and apologising where necessary as well.
Mm. Yeah, there's a really important piece of work happening in the LGBT community at the moment that we're kind of fortunate to support in Rowan Trust, which is developing an LGBT redress scheme, essentially. So the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission have a grouping that are working in this at the moment, and essentially it's to expunge or delete convictions that men received because of their sexuality in history. So and it's a really fascinating project. I mean, it's terrible for the men who are still alive because of the trauma that they experienced, but also what we're trying to do is look back in history as well beyond that, so not just because obviously the vast majority of men who were convicted for being themselves are now dead. So we're looking at how to posthumously expunge their records as well, and who can do it and all of that, so we're having conversations about, historians, having been in a position to be able to take a case and have a person's record expunged, or an LGBT community organization been able to do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to be able to, for somebody. And I just love the idea of somebody from 200 years ago who had this awful time, ended up in jail, and may have died as a result, whatever, for the state to now go like, we got this wrong, even though it's 200 years later, we got it wrong, and it's really important for how we grow and, develop as a community going forward.
Absolutely. So, Michael, you didn't tear off to New York, but it sounds of it, maybe you did at some point. But take me from Trinity to BelongTo, and what happened in those years, and how did it all begin?
Yeah, but I did go up to New York to come out. So actually, I'm a J1 visa.
Okay.
So in the mid-90s, I went over to New York, my friend Tom, and I mean, he understood that we were going over to work for the summer and go on the piss, which obviously did happen. But I was also going over to come out, which I didn't know was going to happen so easily. And we were staying with a friend of my brother's up in the Bronx. Sorry, I can't remember the name of it now, but it's a really Irish area up in the Bronx. And on one of the first nights, I got the subway downtown, and got off the subway in the East Village, and walked out and around the corner, and there was a bar called Wonder Bar, and there was loads of gay men standing outside, kind of spilling out into the streets. It was like a Saturday night, whatever. And I just immediately went like, this is fucking it. This is fucking amazing. And there's a guy there standing there with a cowboy hat on, and all my fantasies had all come true at one time. And I was like, go over and talk to that guy,
You weren't talking to him about hurling, I guess.
Oh yeah, exactly. It wasn't a Garth Brooks hurling conversation, but yeah, but it was some that moment. I did get to live out that fantasy of like, I'm going to New York and I'm going to come out. But did it during those number of months, and then came home a much happier, more confident person.
Yeah,
I'm sure. But I'm not answering your question. But the question about what happened.
No, New York's pretty relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, because it is actually directly relevant. But then after Trinity, what happened really was myself and a friend Aoife were living up in the north inner city, up in Eccles Street in Dublin, and it was 1997, and there was a huge amount of racist graffiti going up all around us because it was a general election, and agitators were starting to stoke those flames like we were talking about earlier on. And myself and Aoife decided we wanted to do something but didn't know what to do. So we contacted the Irish Refugee Council and ended up teaching English to young people and children who had come, mostly at that stage from Romania or from Angola. Actually, there was a lot of migrants coming from Angola because of the war. And I found I absolutely loved it. I just loved the experience, and being being welcomed into people's homes outside of classes to teach extra classes to young Angolan people or young Romanian people. And just with that kind of fire, I ended up going back to college and doing initially just a cert in youth and community work in Maynooth. And out of that, I suppose, that kind of building of a social justice analysis, that went with the love for like the kind of gut feeling for it, kind of then it was brought together with an analysis. It was quite radical, actually. I became a youth and community worker and started off working with homeless young people, actually. So I worked in Focus Ireland for a few years, where a whole bunch of stuff was going on for young people around drugs and sexuality and homelessness. Obviously, a lot of stuff that's happening today was happening then, of course. But that was really the seed for me. I was very young. I often think at that time, though, when I really self just on a personal level, one of the things that happened was I went to this interview. I was totally unqualified to do a job that I was given, and I went to this interview and there was a woman, Jean Rafter, who was becoming my manager, like saw something in me. And I remember it being a moment of going, God, she's really listening to what I'm saying and saw something and gave me a job. And I often, after a couple of times, I'm like, obviously much more qualified people went for that job than me. Like, I mean, and you gave me the job, whatever. But she did, she saw something. And I remember thinking, God, when I get into those sorts of positions, I'm going to look out for that something, and go with that instinct, and have done actually.
That's it. That's it. Yeah, I was talking to a guy this morning, and he's a great young guy, and he's a bit stuck in different ways, but he doesn't have a degree, and he's like almost delegitimized in the workplace or the work jobs market by virtue of not having a degree. And yet there's an assumption that everyone with a degree is going to be somewhat superiorly prepared or trained or a great worker or great with innovator or whatever. And it's not necessarily the case at all. So there's a great mystique around that. But yeah, I don't know, but youth and community work is good with that anyway. It's ultimately about people, and if the people, it thrives on the goodness and the potentiality of people to get things done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it does, and I think that and I think it's needed more than ever, and I think there are kind of basics to it at the moment that people in decision making positions really need, that ability to understand, ability to listen, ability to go out of the comfort zone, to be in community, to understand the difference between, making decisions on behalf of people versus listening and making decisions based on what they need and want. I mean, all the kind of 101 basics of youth and community work would be really good, are really good in decision making, and I think could be used an awful lot more. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So from that role, then, how did things progress?
Oh yeah. So after that, because so what happened at Focus was I was out as a gay man, and there wasn't anybody else actually in Focus that I knew of at the time. And Focus was a much smaller organization. So Jean, who I mentioned, after was my manager, when an LGBT young person would come in, she'd ask me to key work them, which is like really progressive for the time. And what became apparent to us was that a disproportionate number of young people that were coming into us were LGBT, but there was no service for them to go to at all. So it's just kind of different. Like if a young traveller came in, you'd work with PAVI at PAVI Point, or a young migrant came in, Migrant Rights Centre was setting up around the same time. So that became an issue. And I really loved working with the LGBT young people who were homeless and all sorts of very complicated things going on for them. And then I left to work with the Gay Men's Health Project because they had created an outreach post, and it had a specific focus on youth and on migration. And there were two areas I was super interested in. So I went over to the Gay Men's Health Project, and we had great fun working on the Gay Men's Health Project. Actually, it was such a great time actually. But while we were there, I became involved in setting up what became BelongTo, essentially. So but that period of being in the Gay Men's Health Project, it was the period where medication was coming in around HIV as well. So the world was becoming more optimistic and hopeful for people who were HIV positive, which was really good. And then it also was a period where there was a lot of emphasis being put on campaigning and reaching people with messaging and stuff like that. And it was a really great testing ground for all sorts of things that we'd go on to do in terms of campaigning, So, and we were campaigning on really difficult niche issues like syphilis awareness, because, there was a syphilis outbreak, So how do you get to men who are more likely to contract syphilis? It's a conundrum that's really interesting to figure out, So at one stage we had a campaign with a drag queen called Renteca, who we called the face of syphilis. And we'd do these guerrilla campaigns in bars where you'd run into the bar. The bars wouldn't let you in. So you weren't allowed in some of the bars. So the bars wouldn't let us in, but we'd roll up in a van to the back door of the bar, kind of get in the back door, run around the bar, giving out information on syphilis and how to get tested, and then run out the front and back into the van again. It was great crack.
Guerrilla hit squad.
Guerrilla hit squad. And then there was a bit of success with that. So the HSE, who were also trying to get hold of this outbreak, agreed to come into gay bars and gay venues to test for syphilis.
Yeah.
So we started doing that. Where
Wow.
go into a nightclub and everybody would dress up as a nurse, including Renteka, who was like 7 foot tall. You go around the place asking people if they wanted to be tested. And one night we were out, I remember in the pod, and we'd managed to get this massive queue of people queuing up for the syphilis test, which was a blood test at the time, so it wasn't the easy thing to do. And I got chatting to somebody in the queue, and it's like, oh yeah, thanks very much for doing this, whatever. And they were like, no, thank you. It's so great to get our drugs tested in here. We didn't realize Ireland just got this far. And they thought the queue was to get their drugs tested to see what quality they were. And then once they realized they were in a queue for syphilis, syphilis testing, it dissipated quite a bit.
Well, the drugs testing thing is finally kicked in. I see it's now finally 30 years later at Electric Picnic and so on. But I think that approach speaks to the importance of a kind of a maverick and a creative approach to doing things when the conventions don't work at all, that you need to switch things up and be bolder and braver and accept that the dominant mainstream strategic plan doesn't work or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that comes to mind is that I actually just minded listening to you that it was sexual health that first got me involved in this kind of work as well, in that I worked in Letterkenny and I was basically doing data entry in the National Health Strategy like 20 years ago or more. And eventually they asked me, did I want to do some work with young people? And I said I did. Then we looked at what are the big issues facing young people, and sexual health became a dominant one, sexual health, mental health. And it became clear that they essentially weren't getting any information anywhere. And so that led me to create a website called cluedup.ie at the time, and it became like the sexual health website. But it was probably just, to be honest, that was in Donegal. It worked pretty good, but it was still kind of hard 20 years ago to get any sort of mainstream support around sexual health in general, because it's still not, even now, something that is not just a very relaxed, normal conversation, and there's massive gaps in curriculum, and some schools don't do it at all, and then it's left to the realm of pornography or wherever else it takes place. So it's just interesting. But I never got to dress up as a nurse or anything like that.
It's so tiring. It's so tiring. It's so tiring. You're still a young man.
Yeah, maybe that's for another day or another lifetime, but yeah. So from there, you got involved in setting up. So round about what year was that, Michael? Now that BelongTo you were kicking off.
BelongTo, yeah. So we began in 1999, and it opened its doors in 2003. So it's 4 years of it, and there's variations on it, but what became BelongTo started in 2003. Yeah.
Okay, because I think it was 2005 that I set up Spun Out. So you were certainly ahead of us in that regard. And then that began the big intensive foray into NGO nonprofit management, because you start off in this lovely grassroots community workplace, and then the next thing you have to get your spreadsheets on.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, big time. Yeah, we had a nice moment for a few years actually at BelongTo, because it took a while to get going, as I was saying. And I loved the actual community work and the youth work. That was the thing that I got into it for. And I think actually I was looking at it recently because I'm writing a book, plugging my book. It's not written, but I'm writing a book at the moment about the LGBT youth movement in Ireland. So I have a huge amount of documentation about BelongTo in the early days and all of that. But I was looking at our kind of guiding opening manifesto, so and I think it was really what made BelongTo different, I suppose, to other things that were around at the time, was that it wasn't set up to be a youth group. So it wasn't set up to be a support group. It was set up to be a social change movement, and that was very explicitly stated. Because you had a lot of really radical heads came together to do it. Amazing woman, Fran McVeigh, who was a brilliant youth and community worker from Belfast, who again, unfortunately, passed away this year, who was completely coming from very kind of working class analysis, politics. And myself coming from a situation of working with homeless young people and young people involved in drug use and sex work. You had people from the switchboard who had been kind of coming from very radical left leaning politics as well. So we weren't like caretakers, you know, we were going with a kind of an agenda.
It was about empowerment ultimately.
Yeah, it was about empowerment ultimately, exactly. And the youth group piece then was, they were like vehicles to get to the larger picture of what's the social change we're looking for. But yeah, so we did. I mean, I think while I was there, we did a fairly good job of holding on to those radical principles, even if the veneer of it didn't look like that sometimes. You know, internally, I think we did a fairly good job of it. And I think we were, and I'd often be kind of testy with staff and whatever, just keeping us all on our toes, going like, this mightn't be around much longer. Doesn't belong to, like this is not, like, belong to is not the end goal here. We're not here to sustain ourselves. So at some point there won't be a belong to, but that won't matter. It'll be like, if LGBT young people are equal, that's what'll matter. So you kind of have to kind of keep that in people. It's good community work involves that things are born, then they die, and other things are reborn. So
it's tricky. It's tricky because if you're building anything, it builds and it grows, and then if it's any good, it grows bigger, and then the bigger it gets, the further away it gets to the genesis of the seed of the flame that created it in the first place. And it takes a lot of inbuilt kind of consciousness and knowledge and work to keep the spark and spirit alive. And I suppose I would feel similar in the sense that there was elements of service provision within Spun Out, but at its heart we were trying to create some sort of movement around young people's voice in general in the dominant narrative. And but I have to admit, I think the service provision information element, ultimately the weight of it became so big, and I feel, I think some victories were won, but I kind of feel generally I lost a lot of the fight on that, and it's possibly what led me to get burnt out,
Yeah.
And I also had to surrender then and accept, well, you know what? Maybe the movement has to happen in all sorts of different ways, and it doesn't need to be here. And maybe just these service provision elements and information and support are empowering in their own right, and they're totally required. But I suppose, if the activist spirit isn't there, then I'm almost not interested, because I think we always need to keep challenging where the gaps are, and is this good enough? And as soon as the minister loves you too much, then you're kind of, anyway, so on and so forth. But and it's not necessarily a critique. I'm not exactly au fait with what's going on at Spun Out these days, but I know they very much exist, and they seem to be doing really well from what I can gather online. But it's just more a reflection on organizations in general. This kind of big is better kind of mentality.
No, I think there's a few things that are, got a similar journey in loads of ways, but one, just on the big is better thing, like the big is better mentality is kind of what has got us to the biggest problematic issues we're experiencing at the moment. Like that idea of growth, of perpetual growth, is obviously what got us to where we are in terms of the environment and in terms of all sorts of things we've already talked about. Then in terms of, I suppose, community organizations, I think whether it happens within an organization, so I think organizations can die and reborn and be reborn internally, and I think
absolutely
has done that a few times, where it kind of changes what it did and became something else a number of times, and that can be really good. But then also it's good for some organizations to die, and for others to start, and I always think there's that idea of the earth has essentially a mushroom, we have an actual living being whose purpose is to, take in what dies and regenerate it and sustain what's going to grow next, so it's completely natural. And I think sometimes we feel that things ending or changing or a loss or a failure, where in fact they can be exactly the opposite, so I think that. And then I think in terms of our civil society and service provision, it's a really big issue, and it's an area that I'm working on at the moment, which is the whole area of freedom of civil society. And a lot of things kind of creep, but I think, civil society, whose primary purpose in many ways, whose primary purpose, I'll be bolder, whose primary purpose is to hold government to account, to deliver on behalf of its people. That's the primary purpose of civil society. But once we get into a civil society who's becomes too co-opted into government, or becomes the government's service provision wing or net or arm, then it does lose its ability to hold government to account. And I think that's happened quite a bit. And that's not necessarily a critique of civil society. We had a meeting with leaders recently. It is a critique of how funding happens, though, so if the HSE is funding organisations in a certain way, then it's hard for them to be critical. But also what is happening now is government bodies are going a step further and writing into contracts that they're not allowed to critique. So for instance, if you get funding from, I don't know, Department of X, then you're no longer allowed to critique the policies of Department X, and that's a completely unreasonable position to push civil society in. And it's not what people signed up to do, and we don't have a big state. So we don't have the state infrastructure to deliver health and education and all the rest of it. So if you want an independent, cheap service delivery, then the state can't be gagging.
Yeah, and the civil society doesn't have a large philanthropic sector to go elsewhere here. So they're forced into that corner.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and that is, I suppose, what we are trying to do at the moment with the Rowan Trust, is to provide some level of security to organisations that are willing to go and want to go that extra mile in advocating for people's rights and communities' rights, and organisations that are looking beyond this year. I mean, we need a vibrant civil society that has a 20-year vision. But the funding mechanism only allows them to have a 1-year vision because they don't know whether it'll be funded next year. So there is a responsibility on funders to provide that security. Yeah. Because, just also say, Rory, because there's two things I think going on. One is that it feels like for some people that there's a death of imagination in civil society. And then for others going, well, it's not a death of imagination, it's the fact that we're not allowed to imagine anymore. So there's two things going on, and I'm not saying it's all one or the other. There's probably a combination of both happening.
Yeah, and it's all happening within a sort of we sort of understand the mechanics of neoliberalism, but it's also the kind of the psychology of neoliberalism, of how it closes down space. And I suppose that's where it's interesting to have funders, and they seem to be few and far between. There seems to be a few in the United States and not too many elsewhere that are actually stepping back and critiquing the actual systems that are creating the problems, because it seems to be that, and I mean, you and I are beneficiaries of the whole kind of social entrepreneur scene, and a lot of that is really good because it helps you get up and running and all the rest, but it doesn't necessarily focus in and going, why are there so many problems? And then what we need is pioneering innovative solutions and innovative, amazing young leaders to go and fix all the problems. And it just creates a happy cycle, like a happy, cheery cycle. But if you did a systemic or a strategic review properly, you would really ascertain that this is not a sustainable model of facilitating social change.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I never accepted I was a social entrepreneur, by the way. So I know we were called that, but even at the time, critiquing it, I always felt very uncomfortable because, and I still think there's more, 10 or more years after those things happened to both of us, we both got these social entrepreneur awards, but that no social change I've ever come across has been driven by a person. Like that notion is just fucking nonsense, and I know that we need hero stories for narrative work, and I get it, and they're inbuilt, and we have biblical stories and Greek stories, and there are heroes in them, right? I mean, it's literally what they're about. But when it comes to big social change that's needed and happens in societies, it's always thousands of people, over very long periods of time. And I think that philanthropy has been responsible for interrupting a very legitimate and important movement understanding of community work to centralize it on individuals in a neoliberal way. So I think it's time for us to correct that and to go, and to go back to, valuing community work, valuing working, people coming together for collective action, as opposed to pulling one person out and giving them an award,
That's actually, speaking of awards, did you remember you got another award, the Cahill Ryan Fellowship, Scholarship?
Yes.
Well, do you know where I'm going with this?
Well, you were up for it as well, right?
Apparently I came second, so there you go. And I was like, I remember at the time I was so busy and stressed, and I was living in Galway, and I went up on the bus, and they didn't tell anyone who got, well, at least they didn't tell me, but it was announced on the night. And I remember getting the bus to Dublin and going, oh, I have to go to this thing, see who got it. And then I had to get the bus back, but it was like you had to wait there and go, this guy. But then they told me later I came second, and I was like, that's even worse.
Way worse. That's way worse. Oh my God. I totally remember. Yeah, but you were really high profile at the time. Like, and I went along presuming you were going to get the award, by the way. And also, we were late. We were really late getting to it ourselves. So it was having David Carroll, who I worked with, and Jamie, my partner, sorry, my husband. The three of us went along, and sure, of course, we went to the pub beforehand and then wandered in because we were, although we were in it.
You didn't deserve it at all. Now, clearly.
I know. We were trying to be a bit rock and roll.
No, you actually. I remember clearly thinking you did very much deserve it. To be honest, Michael, and you know that's evidence that the work that you did go on to do then, it wasn't like, because clearly I thought that fellowship was actually very good. I don't know what your experience of it was, but it was, at the time it looked to me that it was designed to create space for someone to think, and at the time I was coming towards my end of spun, I think, or at least it was in the horizon, and I remember going, I wish somebody would just fund me to, like, because we have to pay rent and so on and so forth, and that's the big problem, is that you can't take time out. And I remember thinking that's an amazing thing to create, that sort of element of fellowship or whatever.
It was, you know, and in fair play to the One Foundation and Declan Ryan for doing it, because it was massive for me. Because, yeah, I mean, I went from having a fairly parochial view of the world in terms of justice and LGBT rights, to having a much more global view. You know, I went to New York and spent time with LGBT organizations over there. I went to South Africa for quite a while, for a number of months, you know, working in an archive in Johannesburg, and then in an LGBT and HIV organization in Cape Town. And it was completely changed my complete view on what was going on in the world, you know, and being able to put that perspective on what's happening and linking it in with what's happening elsewhere. Yeah. And I often thought that it opened up another world, which is the world of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and then also kind of grew my understanding of where things are really, really hard to get done. You see often the best work happening, you know, and the most important innovative things, and also I suppose gave me a really good sense of class analysis and post-colonial analysis, and all of those things that I knew kind of in terms of text, but then kind of living them out with people in communities that were, you know, really impoverished and were really very recently experiencing post-colonialism, as in Africa or in Eastern Europe in terms of the Soviet Union. All of that stuff became real. It became really alive. Yeah. So it was really great. And also, some of my closest friends are the people from that period as well, you know, and it kind of reversed this idea that, you know, here we were as white Western Europeans going to tell others how to do the work. It almost exactly happened the other way around, where I definitely brought home way more than I arrived with. You know?
Well, that does speak to also this kind of, you know, it goes against almost some of what you're saying, but it doesn't contradict it necessarily, is this idea that everything is ultimately, we're interdependent as beings. We all need people to be there to support us, to do marketing, to do fundraising, to do campaigning. It's all about building community. It's about movements. It's about collective action. And then this, you know, pick any hero and they're ultimately dependent on someone else. Like David Bowie needed people to do his artwork, to do his production, whatever he needed, to teach him how to dance, to do his makeup. But
he never became a very good dancer. I'd say it was the one thing he wasn't very good at.
Taking down Bowie. It's almost sacrilege, is it? So, like, you know, what I'm getting at here is all of that is true, and yet there are these individuals like yourself that are wholeheartedly dedicated and did require that space at that time, and you did get that very, very unique offering, because I don't think there's been very much like it, if anything, since. And it has stood to you. It was a wise investment in an individual.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, and I don't think it does contradict the collective action, because communities always need people to perform certain tasks, and one of those tasks is leadership at particular moments. It's kind of how I see it. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, yeah, but we're trying to mirror it at the moment, actually, in the Rowan Trust. So when we're granting certain organizations, and as part of the grant, we're providing a breathing space grant for often their executive director, but sometimes maybe not, for them to have some thinking space as well. So the idea is it's kind of a smaller version of the Colin Ryan Scholarship. The scale of money is smaller, but the idea is like that the grant comes with very few stipulations, like it's core granting to an organization. The only stipulation is that you use this amount of money for whatever you think you need it for your own personal and professional development.
It's there is an awareness of that within the arts community. So residencies are a thing where you go off and you do your 2-week residency or your 2-month residency, whatever it is. And the Arts Council, or whoever it is, based on the application and the portfolio of track record of evidence, says, on balance, this person is more than likely to deliver something on this. We don't need to know the defined outcomes, and we just trust them to be the artists that they are.
Yeah.
And this, it kind of challenges that sort of productive, well, I don't mean it because it is productive, but that defined outcomes KPI cult. I'm saying it's a cult, but it's a bit harsh perhaps, but like, KPIs, maybe they do have some function, but they can also be so reductive that they miss the point sometimes.
Okay. Yeah, God, I think we're both very fortunate. We both because we both live with artists, right? We both.
That's true, actually.
Jamie's a singer and a musician, and Susie's a singer and musician as well, right? So, so I think our worlds are intertangled with artist worlds, and I actually do have more friends who are artists than are activists per se, as in their day job. So I see all the worlds have always been a bit intertwined, but I think in that activist world, like if we lose the idea that we're creatives, I think we're in trouble. You know what I mean? Like, you have to be creative to be able to do the work. I mean, there is, of course, administrative functions that happen in movements, for sure. But if we lose that creativity, because God, I always think that good activism, maybe like good artistry as well, is it's like time travel, where you kind of need to like be able to have a view backwards in terms of what's happened to get us to this point. So you're not reproducing things, and you bring the wisdom from people. So I, for instance, love surrounding myself with older women. That's a thing, but like just like older, really wise women, who've done incredible work over years, and have just been so generous with their time and wisdom for me. And then also to be able to think forward, to imagine what it is that we're going to. So it's that kind of over and back all the time.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought out that I wouldn't ever say I love to surround myself with older women, but as it happens, I am surrounded by a lot of older women, in that I'm very friendly, particularly where I live, with a lot of older women. And I have often reflected that they often are the stalwarts of community leadership and are not the ones that get social entrepreneur awards and so on, but are always at the cold face of change, and particularly around direct provision and integration for refugees and so on. Where every time I've seen it, it's always older women to the rescue, and that can be celebrated, but it also speaks to something going, where is everyone else right now?
No, massively, yeah. And just the willingness to take the risk that's involved in getting involved in social change work, particularly at a community level, as a geographical community level, because there are risks. People will respond badly if you're promoting an anti-racist message in a particular community, for instance, and it is very telling that it's more likely to be women than men. As you know, or you mentioned Donegal earlier. I mean, I lived in Donegal, myself and Jamie's family are from there, in Inishowen for a period of time, and we were there during the 2018 referendum, the abortion referendum, such, and going out canvassing, just doing our bit, whatever, locally. And I know in ways repeal was a woman's issue in many ways, but it was quite striking that there was a gang of maybe 30 or 40 canvassers that were pretty much all women that were out doing this. I mean, knocking on a door in rural in a show, and it's not easy. Like, you know, I mean, doing that really frontline work. Yeah, and I suppose the question is, yeah, where was everything else? But also, like, but also maybe not. I suppose an appreciation of how fucking hard that was for those women to do that, you know, and they did it, yeah, and yeah, they won't get an award, as you say, yeah.
Well, we'll award them here now, and maybe that is something to be looked at. Is this kind of, well, then again, you know, there's also humility that seems to go with it, that people don't want or seek awards or recognition, and that's a big part of change as well. Just another thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up in a while, Michael, is the work that you did with Equate, and doing some work around the role of church and schools and church and state and that kind of work, and how that was for you, what it involved, and what have been your reflections since.
Yeah, so Equate essentially was a campaign. Yeah, we set it up as an organization, but it was ultimately a campaign. So we got 2 years funding, and then we ran it for 2 years, like full hog. So we always went like, how far can we get in terms of changing the dynamic of church and state in the education system? And I suppose it's kind of most known as a baptism barrier organization. So we were the ones, along with Education Equality and others, who, you know, had essentially had the Department of Education make it illegal for Catholic schools, which are still 90% of primary schools, to use religion as an admissions criteria. I hope that's not too long-winded way of explaining that. But the work itself, yeah, it was fascinating because it came about really from all the other work. I think all these things were built, don't they? But I mean, all the years I BelongTo of working in the education system, where we had to just accept the fact that, you know, that the majority of schools were religiously maintained in Ireland. Like, it wasn't something that was on the cards for us to get involved in. And then you find all your workarounds, you know, to make those things work, like working with religious schools and then becoming LGBT friendly, for instance, was happening, and it was quite a challenge. But the fact that the Catholic Church was and does teach homophobia, there's just no two ways about it. Like, and in the moment, you know, transphobia in particular, there isn't any way of pretending that's not going on in schools. You know, it is going on in schools. And I suppose I kind of got to a point of just being so fed up of trying to find the workarounds, going, well, what if we just took on the issue? Like, the elephant in the room is that children and young people are being taught homophobic attitudes and beliefs in their school because of the religious denomination of the school. So let's take it on and see where we can go to with it. So that was kind of it. And I suppose the baptism, why taking on the baptism barrier? Because we did loads of other things, but taking on the baptism barrier one came about because that's what had surfaced from parents. And I suppose maybe what wasn't shown, because we tried to maintain a very mainstream image, you know, because we wanted it to be available to everybody, you know, not only certain groups. But what underneath that, what was happening was that a lot of migrant families who weren't Catholic were having real problems getting into schools, getting their children in schools in certain areas, particularly urban areas. A lot of LGBT families were finding it hard to get their children into school because they weren't baptizing their child for all the reasons you can imagine. So there were particular communities that were of interest to us always, you know. So yeah, and then we did, and it was a really interesting experience of working up close and personal with the Department of Education, you know, because in many ways they have a reputation, right, of being difficult to work with. But there were some really interesting, and I'd go as far as say radical civil servants in there who had the opportunity to work on with this. And there definitely was a desire within certain areas of the Department of Education to have the baptism barrier removed. People were just so fed up with it. And then we had a minister, who was Richard Bruton, who I think was just a very logical person, you know, of like, give me the evidence and we'll work from there. You know, it wasn't ideological. There was no ideological element in it, and I guess had the power and influence within government because of being around for quite a while. He's a pretty decent person, actually. Was able to drive it through on a political level. Yeah, so I think it was almost like, while nobody's looking, let's get rid of the baptism barrier. That's what it kind of looks like, because it was also sandwiched between marriage equality and repeal, so it kind of isn't really seen too much. But in ways, will have a big influence on the future shape of Irish
Yeah, no,
society.
absolutely. Huge issue. So was it after that you did the PhD?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, the PhD's been going on for a long time, but it was after Equate that I saw, like, let's just stop now altogether. And I was quite burnt out actually as well.
Okay.
You mentioned burnout. Yeah, so there was a huge amount of backlash against Equate going on behind the scenes, from religious organizations and others as well who were opposed to the work. So, and that got really highly personalized, and I just needed a break, and the funding was up, so I said, like, let's just concentrate on the PhD. So I went up to Donegal to do that and lived there for a couple of years. So that's when that came about.
Great.
I thought doing the PhD was a break, but it wasn't. Obviously, it was fucking desperately hard. Don't recommend it.
Yeah, I actually signed up for one in UCD a number of years ago and got the funding and everything, but I just started writing a book, so I knew it was one or the other, and the book was kind of killing me as it was, and I would definitely drown. And I'm back doing a master's now, and I do definitely find the academic bit it's not my favorite bit, but anyway, it is what it is,
Yeah.
but yeah, I wouldn't be doing it for a break or a rest.
I know. So I didn't know what it was involved. It was something different.
Yeah, would you not go on a sun holiday? So you're now in the hot seat of the Rowan Trust, and it's popping up in various places on my radar, and definitely getting a good vibe, a good sense of it, and it feels timely and fresh, and it's good to have someone like yourself that has these clearly broad range of experience and perspectives here to kind of help facilitate a lot of the great work that is going on elsewhere. So can you just maybe give me a sense of how things are going for you at the moment, and what you see is what's on the horizon?
Yeah, so it's going really well. So we are set up we do this thing called trust-based philanthropy, which is a reverse of what we've kind of talked about, or reverse, a kind of reimagining of what we talked about in terms of funding landscape. So the idea really is that you, as a funder, have to work really hard to be a partner of a civil society organization. So there's a lot of work in it from our end, and the idea is that, well, we have a plan that involves, tackling racism and tackling the rise of the far right and various freedom of civil society. And then when we locate partners who are doing the same thing, then we spend a long time getting to know each other and making sure we have an alignment. But once we fund, we leave them off to do the work, and we back off and we don't get involved. That's the thing. So there's no KPIs, for instance, involved at all. And it's going really well. I mean, so far we funded the Migrant Rights Centre, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, Citywide, which is drugs campaign. So we have a strong emphasis on having a rational evidence-based drugs approach. And we funded Ski and Press, who publishes authors from minority marginalized communities. So yeah, it's good. I mean, it's modest. It's a modest philanthropic organization. We have a set amount of money that we can give away each year or invest each year. So we're kind of fairly careful and strategic, and we're trying to take on a number of things. But one of our focus is on culture. So I think a lot of what's kind of happened in the past with funding is you kind of look like you have culture funding and then you have NGO funding, and never the twain shall meet. Kind of going, well, for social change to happen, you need both things to be happening at the same time. So we're attempting to cross over that. And we funded like Lynn Rowan's podcasts and Conversations from the Margins recently, and a TV documentary is coming out next year. Yeah, so the idea really is to kind of take a step back and look at what are the big social issues that we're looking at, and how can some independent money help change those issues for the better, or whatever the case might be. And I suppose what we're not doing is funding service delivery. We don't see that as our role, but we are funding communities to assert their rights, basically, in various ways, whatever way that is.
Great.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're loving it, as in it seems like it fits down to like it love, and that you've found a great home for yourself.
Yeah, I absolutely love it, and I get to work with some amazing people. I get to work with amazing colleagues, Jamie and Amel, and we have a really great board. And I really like it a lot, and also because it takes such a long time. So where are we now? Yeah, I mean, God, it can take us up to 9 months of working with an organization before we fund them, and working with them is, as I say, we're all working together. But by the time you get to that point, you kind of know them really well, and I really feel very confident in them, and they're taking on, sorry, the organizations we support are taking on, and we're helping from the background, big issues like interrupting the rise of the far right and presenting alternative narratives and, exploitative work practices, the war on drug policy, which essentially still what Ireland has, the disservice it's doing to working class communities. So some of the really tricky issues that are there, we all know about, but are, a bit hesitant to take on board, and, and funders are a bit hesitant to get on board. And I suppose in the longer view, I hope that the fact that, an international foundation will get on board at this stage with these issues will make it safer for funders to get on board as well. Yeah. It might take a few years, but hopefully they will as well.
Yeah. Well, listen, Michael, it's been absolutely fascinating. We've done the life and the times of, we've gone to New York, and you've the cowboy hats and all sorts, hurling talk and funders and philanthropy, and really great work you've done over the years. So thank you on behalf of all those that have benefited. And often the change is unseen, and obviously you're not looking for the thanks or the rewards. But you've got enough awards, as we discussed.
that Caroline award.
I still want my second place medal. Anyway, we're all good.
Thanks, Rory. It's really nice to connect back in with you, actually, to be honest, after all these years. I've also been keeping track of where you've been going and what you've been doing and what you've been saying since spun out and belong to, and I really appreciate it and admire it, actually. So thank you.
Good stuff. Listen, thanks very much, Michael. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a million.
Hello, Rory McKiernan here again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Love and Courage podcast, and a big thanks to Michael for being part of it. I really enjoyed that conversation, and if you enjoyed the episode, please do consider sharing it out there with friends, family, neighbours, colleagues, putting it out into the world so that it can reach and inspire more people. And if you want to help the podcast reach and grow and inspire more people all over the world, then you can chip in over at loveandcourage.org, either on a once-off or on a monthly basis. It all adds up to helping the podcast grow and reach more people and creating waves of change, inspiration for change and movements for change. You can do that over at loveandcourage.org, and all support, no matter what form, is appreciated, and a big thanks to existing patrons as always. Do remember, you can check out the archives, lots of great conversations in there. You can follow me, Rory McKiernan, on various social media platforms. I have another podcast, it's a bit of a side project called the Creative Souls of Clare podcast, and you can check out my book Hitching for Hope. It's available paperback, ebook and audiobook. Lots in the main bookshops and so on, main book sites, and at hitchingforhope.com. That's it, folks. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, here's to a world of more love and courage.